It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Douglas Hedley, who is Reader in Hermeneutics and Metaphysics at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of Clare College. He's well known to theological audiences in the English-speaking world and in Europe for his work on Platonism, Romanticism, theology, literature and aesthetics, and among his many publications are a study of Coleridge, philosophy and religion, and an acclaimed trilogy on the religious imagination. This morning, Dr. Hedley speaks to us on the subject of Samuel Taylor Coleridge and the Trinity.
A student yesterday, an old student of mine, we were having a glass in the pub last night, and I mentioned in passing that I would be using technology during my talk, and he had a rather worried look on his face. Very fortunately, yes, my page is up there. So thank you to Father George for this invitation, which I'm very honoured to speak at this wonderful conference here at Pusey House. And if I may use this opportunity to thank Geoffrey Rao, who's in here today, and who put me on to Coleridge in the very first place when I was a Callow youth in Keble, just across the road, and put me into this minefield of treasures that is the great STC. I was a bit surprised to hear in the last couple of days that we had a revival of the Trinity in the 20th century. Figures like Rana or Karl Barth, and I suppose that just reflects my own interests and obsessions, lodged as they often are in the 19th century, because it seems to me that Coleridge is very definitely a Trinitarian thinker. Though he is, and this relates to some observations in other papers, perhaps more of an Alexandrian than a Cappadocian in his theology. We had a wonderful papers yesterday about the Gospels and St. Paul, and I think that Romans 1:20, of course alongside John's prologue, and indeed Galatians 2:20, not I but Christ in me, these are key texts for Coleridge's, at one level, deeply biblical theology of the Trinity. The Logos that is proclaimed in John's prologue is also the same Logos who indwells, and that is the Logos through whom the Spirit provides the renewal and the sonship, which for Coleridge is at the heart of the Christian good news. But perhaps it's rather amusing.
I can change your settings, that doesn't happen when we do
that. Would be great. Thank you very much. But perhaps one reason for this obliviousness to Coleridge's role here is the thought that he is, after all, much better known as the poet of Kubla Khan and the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, rather than as a theologian or a philosopher. Yet it was John Stuart Mill who regarded Coleridge as one of the paradigmatic thinkers of the 19th century, the great alternative to Jeremy Bentham for the Victorians. Mill regarded Coleridge as one of the two great seminal minds of England. He writes, "By Bentham beyond all other men have been led to ask themselves in regard to ancient or received opinion, is it true? And by Coleridge, what is the meaning of it?" Mill speaks of the Germano-Coleridgian doctrine, the revolt against the philosophy of the 18th century. It was, he says, ontological because the 18th century was experimental, conservative because the 18th century was innovative and infidel. It was concrete and historical because the 18th century was abstract, whereas the previous age was prosaic. The revolt against it, led by Coleridge, was poetic. So that's Mill's verdict on Coleridge as a thinker and a paradigmatic thinker. But if you have a look at this page here, I've just selected a passage out of my rather well-thumbed copy of the Biographia, you will see why many readers find Coleridge a rather puzzling figure. So if we have a look at this, you can see... Can everybody hear me in the back? No? Okay. So we start off with a reference to the empiricism of Hobbes and Hartley and their masters in ancient Greece, with the claim that all real knowledge presupposes prior sensation. Now here's Coleridge's counterclaim, that sensation itself is but vision nascent. So this is a theme of my talks. We're going to explore why he's making this concept of vision so central. Note here, not the cause of intelligence, but intelligence itself, revealed as an earlier power in the process of self-construction. Even the computer can't cope with Coleridge.
Well, sorry, it doesn't work. I thought you had a pointer.
Okay, well, please bear with me. So, we then, after this bit of idealistic metaphysics, which I'll come back to in a moment, we then have a quotation from Synesius, great Neoplatonic Christian bishop, of which the opinions differ to how Neoplatonic and how Christian he really was. But anyway, let's leave that aside. Bearing this in mind, that intelligence is a self-development, not a quality supervening to a substance, we may abstract from all degree for the purpose of philosophic construction, reduce it to Kant under the idea of indestructible power with two opposite and counteracting forces, which by metaphor borrowed from astronomy we may call the centrifugal and centripetal forces. Now, this is a classic instance of the bizarre aspect of Coleridge, this fusion of idealistic language, this references to late antiquity, and then notice, however, that it culminates in a reference to the doctrine of the absolute, and then look here. Should we attempt it, we must be driven back from ground to ground, each of which we would cease to be a ground in the moment we pressed on it. We must be whirled down the gulf of an infinite series. But this would make our reason baffle the end and purpose of all reason, namely unity and system. Or we must break off the series arbitrarily and affirm an absolute, something that is in and of itself at once cause and effect, causa sui, subject and object, or rather the absolute identity of both. But as this is inconceivable except in a self-consciousness, it follows that even as natural philosophers we must arrive at the same principle from which as transcendental philosophers we set out. That is, in a self-consciousness in which the principium essendi does not stand to the principium cognoscendi in the relation of cause to effect, but both the one and the other are co-inherent and identical. You start to hear this Trinitarian language. Thus, the true system of natural philosophy places the sole reality of things in an absolute, which is at once now, again, the causa sui language. Causa sui et effectus pater auto partor huius hiautu, in the absolute identity of subject and object, which it calls nature, and which in its highest power is nothing else but self-conscious will or intelligence. Now, it's passages like this that will lead many commentators to tear their hair out or say this is just a mumbo-jumbo, or Coleridge was confused. What I want to do in my talk today is give some kind of account of the reasoning here, and particularly in terms of his explication of Exodus 3:14, the I am that I am, the great declaration of the burning bush. But of course, you can see why Coleridge in his own day was ridiculed, I mean, sometimes rather savagely. I recommend to you in particular the account given by Peacock in Nightmare Abbey. In this satirical portrait, we have Coleridge as the doleful Mr. Flosky, a man of note in the literary world. Peacock identifies the name as a corruption of philosophy from the Greek philoskios, a lover of shadows. And here's a quote from the passage about Coleridge. Tea, late dinners, and the French Revolution have played the devil, says Mr. Flosky. Tea has shattered our nerves, late dinners make us slaves of indigestion, the French Revolution has made us shrink from the name of philosophy. Sir, the great evil is that there is too much commonplace light in our moral and political literature, and light is a great enemy to mystery, and mystery is a great friend to enthusiasm. Now, this enthusiasm for abstract truth is an exceedingly fine thing, as long as the truth, which is the object of the enthusiasm, is so completely abstract as to be altogether out of reach of the human faculties, and in that sense, I have myself an enthusiasm for truth. But in another, for the pleasure of metaphysical investigation lies in the means, not in the end, for if the end could be found, the pleasure of the means would cease. The mind, to be kept in health, must be kept in exercise. The proper exercise of the mind is elaborate reasoning. Analytical reasoning is a base and mechanical process which takes to pieces and examines bit by bit the rude material of knowledge and extracts therefrom a few hard and obstinate things called facts. Everything in the shape of which I cordially hate. But synthetical reasoning, setting up as its goal some unattainable abstraction, like an imaginary quantity in algebra, to the unspeakable benefit of the human intellect. Oh, the beauty of this process is that at every step it strikes out in two branches in a compound ratio ramification, so that you are perfectly sure of losing your way and keeping your mind in perfect health by perpetual exercise of an interminable quest. And for these reasons I have christened my eldest son Immanuel Count Flosky. Now, those who know Coleridge will realise that this ridicule. But let me turn here from Peacock to Newman, whose comments I think are very interesting. Newman speaks of Coleridge as a very original thinker, while he indulged a liberty of speculation that no Christian can tolerate, advanced conclusions which were often heathen rather than Christian, yet, after all, instilled a higher philosophy into inquiring minds than they had hitherto been accustomed to accept. So the two aspects of that quote that I want to stress here is Newman's comment about the liberty of speculation, perhaps this Alexandrian side of Coleridge that Newman, of course, knew well, but also this sense of Coleridge instilling a higher philosophy into inquiring minds. He's even using a rather Coleridgean language here. And this higher philosophy is linked essentially to Coleridge's interest in the Trinity. This is a passage in the Biographia where he talks about being a Trinitarian philosophically, while he was a Unitarian as a Christian. These principles I held philosophically, while in respect of revealed religion, I remained a zealous Unitarian. I considered the idea of the Trinity as a fair scholastic inference from the being of God as a creative intelligence, and that it was therefore entitled to the rank of an esoteric doctrine of natural religion. But seeing in the same no practical or moral bearing, I confined it to the schools of philosophy. The admission of the Logos as hypostasized. I seem to have lost it here. Anyway, the point is this. Just on the own side, I see. Great, thank you. Yes. Neither the attribute or personification in no respect removed my doubts concerning the incarnation and the redemption by the cross, which I could neither reconcile in reason with the impassiveness of divine being, nor in my moral feelings with the sacred distinction between things and persons, the vicarious payment of debt and the vicarious expiation of guilt. The more thorough revolution in my philosophic principles and the deeper insight into my own heart were yet wanting. So this is the description of a young man who grows up as the son of a priest in the West Country of England. He's sent to Christ Hospital, a school for the children of clergymen. He then goes to Jesus on a clerical scholarship. He's trained to become a priest of the Church of England. And Jesus is the hotbed of Unitarianism. William Friend was one of the leading young fellows of Jesus, and he was a Unitarian and was acting against the subscription to the articles, and of course the first article, that of the Trinity. Coleridge was caught up in this Unitarian revolt as a young man in Cambridge, and his early career was shaped by the patronage of Unitarians, as he comes to describe. But notice here, nevertheless, I cannot doubt the difference of my metaphysical notions from those Unitarians in general contributed to my final reconversion to the whole truth in Christ, even as according to his own confession, the books of certain Platonic philosophers, the Liber Platonicorum, commenced the rescue of St. Augustine's faith from the same error aggravated by the far darker accompaniment of the Manichaean heresy. So you can see Coleridge putting his own journey from Unitarianism to Trinitarian theology in the Augustinian frame. Now, and this of course is from a young man who is aware of higher criticism. He's also sensitive to the enormous social and political upheavals of the day. Now, of course, the doctrine of the Trinity is a most puzzling doctrine, as we've been reflecting the last couple of days. Is it a barely mythical construct akin to the Hindu Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, or some semi-Gnostic philosophical development repudiating or reinforcing Neoplatonic triads, like the so-called noetic triad of being, life, and thought, on intellect and soul, the kinds that many of the Unitarians, like Priestley, were claiming had infected and corrupted Christianity? And Priestley was a very important influence on the young Coleridge. Coleridge came to believe that the doctrine of the Trinity is an inalienable part of Christian theology, but he did not shy from the more speculative dimensions or implications of the doctrine. And here he is critiquing the idea of the corruption of biblical Christianity by late antique Platonism, expressed most forcefully by Joseph Priestley. And Coleridge's rejection of Priestley emerged out of an intellectual and a spiritual struggle. It wasn't merely speculative for Coleridge, an abstruse glass bead game. And I think, by the way, that it's no accident that Gabriel Marcel, the 20th century French existentialist, wrote his thesis with the title Les idées métaphysiques de Coleridge dans leur rapport avec la philosophie de Shelley. Coleridge's influence on the existentialist movement in the 20th century emerges out of this deeply existential dimension of his thought, which is tied up with his recovery of the doctrine of the Trinity. So, how does this metaphysical appropriation or reappropriation of the doctrine of the Trinity work? Well, part of it is, of course, tied up with his Platonic philosophy. These are the words of Charles Lamb, a most beautiful passage that he wrote reminiscing about the 16-year-old Coleridge. Come back into memory like as thou wert in the day spring of thy fancies. With hope like a fairy column before thee, the dark pillar not yet turned, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, logician, metaphysician, bard. How I have seen the casual passer through the cloister stand still, entranced with admiration, while he weighted the disproportion between the speech and the garb of the young Mirandula, to hear thee unfold in thy deep and sweet intonations the mysteries of Iamblichus or Plotinus, for even in those years thou waxest not pale at such philosophic draughts, or reciting Homer in his Greek or Pindar, while the walls of the old Grey Friars re-echoed to the accents of the inspired charity boy. Now, from this wonderful passage about this preternaturally gifted boy, you also have a bit of information about those very early influences on Coleridge. What is also forgotten here is the potent legacy of the Cambridge Platonists. The Cambridge Platonists generally held to consist of Benjamin Whichcote, 1609 to 83, Ralph Cudworth, 1617 to 1618, Henry Moore, 1614 and 1687, many others of course, mark a real turning point in Western thought, because they are the first modern Platonists. They are the first Platonists in the Western tradition who accept modern science. They were fighting against the dominant Aristotelianism of the university, the Protestant scholasticism that dominated in Cambridge in the day. They accepted the new Cartesian philosophy, but they wanted to modify it. They were worried about the implications of it. And they didn't just draw on Plotinus, they also drew on Origen. Origen is an immensely important figure for these thinkers. The Cambridge Platonists could be called the Cambridge Origenists as much as they were, as easily as being called the Cambridge Platonists. And why? Because the doctrine of freedom is absolutely central for them. They were, in a sense, intriguing as critics of what one might call the dark side of Augustine, as represented by Orthodox Calvinism of the age, and particularly the doctrine of double predestination, which they regarded as a sub-Christian doctrine. Now, it's through these factors that or why we can understand how it is that Coleridge can draw upon Plotinus with such readiness and not see this as contradicting his Christian theology. Why? Well, one reason is that the Cambridge Platonists themselves drew on Plotinus in just such a way, and how did they justify it? Well, of course, for them, Plotinus was sitting next to Origen in the classroom when they were learning from Ammonius Saccas, and Plotinus cribbed all the best bits from his Christian neighbour. Now, that may be a story that we don't readily accept today, and in fact most scholars would doubt that it was in fact the very same origin. But nevertheless, for this reason, Plotinus is regarded by Cambridge Platonists, and indeed by Coleridge, as an almost Christian figure. And here, look at this passage. How and whence these thoughts, these strong probabilities, the ascertaining vision again, the intuitive knowledge may finally supervene. Can be learnt only. Sorry, I do apologize. I might oppose to the question with words which Plotinus supposes nature to answer a similar difficulty. Should anyone interrogate her how she works, if graciously she vouchsafe to listen and speak, she will reply, "It behoves thee not to disquiet me with interrogatories, but to understand in silence, even as I am silent and work without words." This is from a very extraordinary treatise of Plotinus, Ennead 3:8, where Plotinus represents nature as itself a process of contemplation, actually part of Plotinus's attack on the Gnostics. Likewise, in the 5th book of the 5th Ennead, speaking of the highest and intuitive knowledge as distinguished from discursive, or in the language of Wordsworth, the vision of the faculty divine, he says, "It is not lawful to inquire from whence it sprang." And then go further down to see, they and they only can acquire the philosophic imagination, the sacred power of self-intuition. Note this link between contemplation and self-knowledge, who within themselves, can interpret and understand the symbol that the wings of the air sylph are forming within the skin of the caterpillar. Those only who feel in their own spirits the same instinct which impels the chrysalis of the horned fly to leave room in its involucrum for antennae yet to come. They know and feel that the potential works in them, even as the actual works of them. In short, all the organs of sense are framed for a corresponding world of sense, and we have it. All the organs of spirit are framed for a corresponding world of spirit, though the latter organs are not developed nor alike, but they exist in all, and their first appearance discloses itself in the moral being. Okay, so, this sense of the immediate that dwells in man is linked here to his sense of the proleptic dimension of the imagination. Note the image of the insect larva and its metamorphosis. It's a clue to Coleridge's actually Trinitarian theology, this idea of renewal through the indwelling of the Spirit. But the vision invoked here is the vision of a correspondent work of Spirit. Here in the Biographia, the lapsed Unitarian is insisting upon the central significance of the great I am, the absolute subject. That is God the Father and the filial word that reaffirmeth it, the paternal ipseity, as he says, affirmed in the filial alterity. Coleridge does not come to admit the Trinity as a reluctant bulwark. It becomes the very fulcrum of his thought. Now, Western theism was forged in late antiquity within that remarkable Greco-Roman Jewish milieu, out of which both Christianity and Islam emerged. The Septuagint translation of the great burning bush theophany of Exodus 3:14, ego eimi ho'on, with its resonance of the unchanging being, to'on referred to in Plato's Timaeus 27d. Philo says of the Exodus passage in 3:14, and this is Philo's commentary on those lines, and he said, first, tell them that I am he who is, ego eimi ho'on, that they may learn the difference between what is, ontos, and what is not. And also the further lesson that no name at all can properly be used of me, to whom being, to'enai, belongs. That's from the Vita Moses, Book 1, Section 75. You might look at De Abrahamo, section 119 and 125. Now, one of the contributions of late antique Platonism was its doctrine of God as both a transcendent source and yet as intimately present to the self. The great I am as related to the finite I am. We think of Augustine, the radiant ipsum, the transcendent ipsum. In the interior man dwelleth truth, it says. The Trinity is a way of articulating here the Godhead as a self-related unity, not as some advitic, strictly monistic principle, but as absolute will, intellect, and love. Shelley developed an interpretation of Exodus 3:14 in his later Munich phase. And it was a period that Coleridge knew well through Shelley's seminal On Human Freedom. Shelley says, in this text, Wollen ist Ursein, will is primordial being. Or, as Shelley says in his later works, that God is the Herr des Seins, the Lord of being. We also know that Shelley, who had studied Platonism through Morsheim's translation of Cutler's true intellectual system, as a student in Tübingen. So as a young theologian, Shelley, like Hegel, had to read Coleridge. It was a set text. And in that true intellectual system, the debates about the Platonic Trinity and the pagan instances of the Trinity were texts that were compulsory reading. And Shelley here is using, almost when he talks about God as the hair designer, Lord of being, he is, it would seem, drawing on one of the great and most peculiar texts of Plotinus, Ennead 6:8, on the will and freedom of the one, where Plotinus talks about the one as the kurios autos, as the Lord itself or himself. So in this metaphysics, we can see Shelley is drawing on a strand of thought about the absolute, deriving from Plotinus's Ennead 6:8, or free will, the will of the one as, in Plotinus's terminology, causa sui. The terminology of causa sui is rooted in Plotinus's Aition Hiautu 1441, Ennead 6:8. The one wills itself to be this being himself, which he always willed and wills. So in this Trinitarian language of self-affirmation, Coleridge could draw on both Plotinus and Shelley. So, why is this important in the sense of what Newman talks about a higher philosophy, instilling a higher philosophy into the age? Well, clearly, Coleridge is opposed to the atheism of what he sees as the dominant Anglo-Gallic philosophy of the age. He is also opposed to the pantheism of Spinoza. So Spinoza talks about the causa sui, but the causa sui of Spinoza is a substance that is beyond good and evil, a substance whose two attributes are thought and extension. So Spinoza's metaphysics won't do for Coleridge either, because of its pantheism, not only its denial of transcendence, but also its denial of the distinction between good and evil. And he's also opposing what the Cambridge Platonists called mechanical theism. So a notion of the deity as some maker in a crude anthropomorphic sense of a purely mechanical universe, and a God who is divorced from that universe, a God whose sacramental presence cannot be discovered. So Coleridge's attempt to develop a richer philosophy for the age, as I think Newman quite rightly diagnosed, was this attempt to attack not just atheism, but also pantheism and the mechanical theism which Coleridge considered to be the core of writers such as William Paley. Speaks of these symbols as the wheels which Ezekiel beheld, the truths and symbols that represent them move in conjunction and form the living chariot that bears up for us the throne of the divine humanity. Well, here we have a reference to the theophany of Ezekiel. And Henry Moore sees Pythagoras as a pupil of Ezekiel. Here's Henry Moore. That Pythagoras was acquainted with the Mosaical or Jewish philosophy, there is ample testimony of it in writers. Clemens calls him the Hebrew philosopher. Clemens again, who writes that it was a common vein that Pythagoras was a disciple of the prophet Ezekiel. Now note this Alexandrian strand that is coming through the Cambridge Platonists into Coleridge. We can understand why Newman was rather concerned about this, but also, of course, the great scholar of the Alexandrian tradition himself, we can understand why Newman had his sympathy and kinship to it. And I think there's another aspect of this contemplative tradition which we ought to bear in mind here. This is perhaps some surprising for some, that the development of the idea of contemplation, particularly as Plotinus draws on Plato in the great passages in the Republic, the Symposium of Phaedrus in particular, and Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, Plotinus develops an account of contemplation in which the procession of all reality, potential and actual, emerges from a transcendent good, and that contemplation is a return to that source. So when Coleridge is talking about the philosophical imagination, the sacred power of its self-intuition, he's talking about a return to that source which is connected to gift. Contemplation is always a return to the giving of the source. It's rooted in Plato's idea of the unbegrudging goodness of the demiurge. The demiurge is without end aphthamos. And this is, I'll just give you a very quick passage from one of the great Enneads, 6-7, where Plotinus says this. He says, when anyone therefore sees this light, then truly he is moved to the forms and longs for the lights which plays upon them and delights in it. Just as with the bodies here below, our desire is not for the underlying material things, but for the beauty imaged upon them. For each is what it is by itself. It becomes desirable when the good colours it, giving a kind of grace to them and a passionate love to the desirers. Then the soul, receiving into itself an outflow from thence, is moved and dances wildly and is stung with longing and becomes love. Note the emphasis on love. Plotinus even uses the language of agape, not just eros, which is very striking. Before this, it is not moved even towards intellect for all its beauty. The beauty of intellect is inactive until it catches from the good, and the soul by itself falls flat on its back and is completely inactive, and though intellect is present, is unenthusiastic about it. But when a kind of warmth from thence comes upon it, yet at the same time it rises higher to something greater which it seems to remember. And as long as there is anything higher than which is present to it, it naturally goes on upwards, uplifted by the giver of its love. So here contemplation is related inextricably to this notion of gift. Now that, of course, is radically Christianized, and there would be two obvious differences here between the Christian account of contemplation, in that obviously in the Christian account there is no mere escape of the solitary to the solitary, but actually the account that we have of the intellectual world in Plotinus is, for those who know this great writer, his account of the cosmos noetos is a world that is full of, that is a world that Plotinus is poikilos, it is it is colourful, it is rich, it is full of, he calls the ideas the agamatas, the statues. These are not Aristotelian abstractions, but these are real energies in the mind of God. And I think the link between this account of the intelligible world and the Christian account of the heavenly Jerusalem is a very rich and intriguing theme. So it's easy, I think, to mock Coleridge for his interest in the German idealists, his interest in Neoplatonism, his interest in the 17th century. And of course, when Carlyle talks about Coleridge sitting on the brow of Highgate Hill, looking down on London and its smoke tumult like a sage escaped from the inanity of life's battle, the practical intellects of the world did not much heed him or carelessly reckoned him to be a metaphysical dreamer, but to the rising spirits of the young generation he had this dusky, sublime character, and sat there as a kind of magus, girt in mystery and enigma in his Dodona oak grove, Mr. Gilman's house in Highgate, whispering strange things, uncertain whether oracles or jargon. Well, one can understand why Carlyle could see Coleridge in these terms, and yet I think that we have here one of the great and productive minds of the 19th century. He says himself, it's the prerogative of genius, I quote here from its reflection, to generate the strongest impressions of novelty while it rescues the stalest and most admitted truths from the impotence caused by the circumstance of their universal admission. Truths of all others the most awful and mysterious, yet being at the same time of universal interest, are too often considered so true that they lose all power of truth, a lie bedridden in the dormitory of the soul, side by side with the most despised and exploded errors. It was, I think, the genius of Coleridge to rediscover truths for his contemporaries, and particularly the truth of that vision glorious